White initiates with aiming for central control and a solid pawn structure, maintaining the dynamic balance of the game. Black responds with a standard developing move that contests central influence and keeps options open, preserving the dynamic balance. White develops the knight too, reinforcing the center and preparing for kingside castling, a solid move in the dynamic balance. Black plays, preparing to develop the king's bishop and reinforcing the square, a sound positional choice. White pushes, contesting the center and aiming for an IQP, isolated queen's pawn, setup or a queen's gambit declined structure. Black opts for intending to fianchetto the queen's bishop to via the long diagonal, aiming for hypermodern central control. The move the knight to c3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g3, claiming key space in the center, allowing the bishop to b4 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the bishop to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on d2 with check, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on d2 executes a favorable trade. This allows the bishop to b7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black pins the knight with disrupting white's pawn structure and development, a tactically sound response. White develops the queen too, attacking the pinned knight and maintaining pressure, a constructive centralizing maneuver. Black repositions the queen too, unpinning the knight and connecting the rooks, a flexible piece placement. White advances, questioning the bishop and preparing for queenside space or potential pawn breaks. Black captures the knight with forcing white to recapture and potentially damage their pawn structure. White recaptures with restoring the pawn structure and keeping queens on the board, a solid response. Black develops the bishop too, activating it on the long diagonal and supporting central control. White plays, intending to fianchetto the king's bishop too, aiming for prophylaxis against black's long diagonal pressure. Black castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the rooks, a fundamental step in development. White fianchettos the bishop too, completing kingside development and preparing to control the long diagonal. Black reinforces the center with solidifying pawn structure and preparing for further development. White castles kingside, ensuring king's safety and unifying the major pieces. Black develops the knight too, supporting the square and preparing for central action or a queenside buildup. White advances, seeking queenside space and potentially creating a passed pawn or opening lines for attack. The move the knight to e4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to b2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to a5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the a-file to e8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the a-file to d1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the queen too, defending the knight and preparing for potential attacks or structural adjustments. Black plays, challenging white's central control and aiming to open lines for their pieces. White places the bishop on, activating it on the long diagonal and pressuring black's position. The move the knight on the d-file to f6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to a5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the F-file takes on b4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the F-file takes on b4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the pawn to b5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to a4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to e1, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to a5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to b5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to a4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the F-file to c8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black responds with maintaining queenside structure and preventing further pawn advances from white. White pushes, gaining further space on the queenside and potentially creating weaknesses in black's structure. Black repositions the rook to, activating it on the open file and preparing for central action. White maneuvers the knight to, potentially rerouting it to a more active square or supporting pawn breaks. The move the pawn to c6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to c5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the b-file takes on c6, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on c6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the knight to d3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to b8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn on the b-file takes on c6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to g5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to c8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the f-file to c1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the f-file to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with recapturing the pawn and activating the bishop. White plays, reinforcing the pawn and preparing for central pawn advances. Black moves the knight to, aiming for tactical opportunities or pressure on white's kingside. White maneuvers the knight to, improving its position and preparing to defend or attack. Black retreats the knight to, a solid defensive move that repositions the piece. White moves the rook to, centralizing the rook and preparing for potential action on the e-file. The move the rook to b8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to c8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the queen to b3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to a7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to h1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to c5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances, opening lines in the center and seeking dynamic play. Black captures, opening the f-file and challenging white's central pawn structure. White recaptures, maintaining a strong central pawn presence and keeping the initiative. Black repositions the rook to, activating it on the open c-file. The move the pawn to d5 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to f4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the queen to c7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black develops the bishop to, repositioning it to control key squares. White moves the queen to, centralizing the queen and maintaining pressure on the queenside. The move the knight to d7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook on the e-file to c1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to a6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to a3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to d7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances, pushing the central pawns and gaining significant space. Black captures, opening lines and simplifying the central structure. The move the knight takes on e5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the e-file to d1, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the rook to e8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to a3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures, stabilizing the center and maintaining piece activity. White exchanges the bishop for the knight with, simplifying the position and maintaining pressure. Black checks with, forcing white to react and potentially improving piece coordination. White moves the king to, tucking it away to safety and avoiding potential checks. Black captures the knight with, recapturing material and simplifying. White recaptures with, recapturing the pawn and centralizing the rook. The move the pawn on the e-file takes on d5 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen takes on c4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the queen takes on c4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on c4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on e6, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the rook on the b-file to c8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White recaptures, opening the c-file for their rook and controlling central squares. Black moves the king to, improving king safety by moving it off the central file. White centralizes the rook to, placing it on an open file to pressure black's position. The move the pawn to h6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to g8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the rook to e7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to a6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to e3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the queen takes on e3, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook on rank 1 takes on e3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to h4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to b2, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. paving the way for the queen to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to a1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook to d8 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to f8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the queen to b2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to b4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to a1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to d6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to h2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the queen to, coordinating pieces and preparing for a decisive attack. The move the rook on the b-file to c8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to b5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the queen to g6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the b-file takes on a4, executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook to f7, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the queen to, creating decisive threats against black's king. The move the rook to g8 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the queen to f8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the rook to f1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to g8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to f7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to a8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the e-file to e7, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop to, delivering a checkmate threat and winning the game decisively.